Chapter 3 of Tarzan and the Ant-Men by Edgar Rice Burroughs. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Matthew Reese, Cordova, Illinois. Tarzan and the Ant-Men by Edgar Rice Burroughs. Chapter 3. Within the dim interior of the strange rocky chamber where he had been so ruthlessly deposited, Tarzan immediately became the center of interest to the several Alalai young that crowded about him. They examined him carefully, turned him over, pawed him, pinched him, and at last one of the young males, attracted by the golden locket, removed it from the ape-man's neck and placed it about his own. Lowest, perhaps, in the order of human evolution, nothing held their interest overlong, with the result that they soon tired of Tarzan and trooped out into the sunlit courtyard, leaving the ape-man to regain consciousness as best he could, or not at all. It was immaterial to them which he did. Fortunately for the lord of the jungle, the fall through the roof of the forest had been broken by the fortuitous occurrence of supple branches directly in the path of his descent, with the happy result that he suffered only from a slight concussion of the brain. Already he was slowly regaining consciousness, and not long after the Alalai young had left him, his eyes opened, rolled dully about the dim interior of his prison, and closed again. His breathing was normal, and when again he opened his eyes, it was as though he had emerged from a deep and natural slumber, the only reminder of his accident being a dull aching of the head. Sitting up, he looked about him, his eyes gradually accustoming themselves to the dim light of the chamber. He found himself in a rude shelter constructed of great slabs of rock. A single opening led into what appeared to be another similar chamber, the interior of which, however, was much lighter than that in which he lay. Slowly he rose to his feet and crossed to the opening. Across the second chamber he beheld another doorway leading into the fresh air and the sunshine. Except for filthy heaps of dead grasses on the floor, the rooms both were unfurnished and devoid of any suggestion that they were utilized as places of human habitation. From the second doorway, to which he crossed, he looked out upon a narrow courtyard walled by great slabs of stone, the lower ends of which, embedded in the ground, caused them to remain erect. Here he saw the young Alalai squatting about, some in the sun, others in the shadow. Tarzan looked at them in evident puzzlement. What were they? What was this place in which he was all too evidently incarcerated? Were these his keepers, or were they his fellow prisoners? How had he come hither? Running his fingers through his shock of black hair in a characteristic gesture of perplexity, he shook his head. He recalled the unfortunate termination of the flight. He even remembered falling through the foliage of the great tree. But beyond that, all was blank. He stood for a moment, examining the Alalai, who were all unconscious of his near presence, or his gaze upon them, and then he stepped boldly out into the courtyard before them, as a lion, fearless, ignores the presence of jackals. Immediately they saw him. They rose and clustered about him, the girls pushing the boys aside and coming boldly close, and Tarzan spoke to them, first in one native dialect and then in another, but they seemed not to understand, for they made no reply. And then, as a last resort, he addressed them in the primitive language of the great apes, the language of Manu the monkey, the first language that Tarzan had learned when, as a babe, he suckled at the hairy breast of Kala, the she-ape, and listened to the gutturals of the savage members of the tribe of Kerchak. But again his auditors made no response, at least no audible response, though they moved their hands and shoulders and bodies and jerked their heads in what the ape-man soon recognized as a species of sign language, nor did they utter any vocal sounds that might indicate that they were communicating with one another through the medium of a spoken language. Presently they again lost interest in the newcomer and resumed their indolent lounging about the walls of the courtyard, while Tarzan paced to and fro its length, his keen eye searching for whatever avenue of escape chance might provide, and he saw it in the height of the walls, to the top of which a long running jump would take his outstretched fingers, he was sure. But not yet. He must wait for darkness to shield his attempt from those within the enclosure and those without. And, as darkness approached, the actions of the other occupants of the courtyard became noticeably altered. They walked back and forth, constantly passing and repassing the entrance to the shelter at the end of the courtyard, and occasionally entering the first room and often passing to the second room, where they listened for a moment before the great slab that closed the outer aperture. Then back into the courtyard again, and back and forth in restless movement. Finally, one stamped a foot upon the ground, and this was taken up by the others until, in regular cadence, the thud, thud, thud of their naked feet must have been audible for some distance beyond the confines of their narrow prison yard. Whatever this procedure might have been intended to accomplish, nothing, apparently, resulted, and presently one of the girls, her sullen face snarling in anger, seized her bludgeon more firmly in her two hands, and stepping close to one of the walls, began to pound violently upon one of its huge stone slabs. Instantly the other girls followed her example, while the young males continued beating time with their heels. For a while, Tarzan was puzzled for an explanation of their behavior, but it was his own stomach that at last suggested an answer. The creatures were hungry, and were attempting to attract the attention of their jailers, and their method of doing so suggested something else, as well, something of which his past brief experience with them had already partially convinced him. The creatures were without speech, even totally unvocal, perhaps. The girl who had started the pounding upon the wall suddenly stopped and pointed at Tarzan. The others looked at him and then back at her, whereupon she pointed at her bludgeon and then at Tarzan again, after which she acted out a little pantomime, very quickly, very briefly, but nonetheless realistically. The pantomime depicted the bludgeon falling upon Tarzan's head, following which the pantomimist, assisted by her fellows, devoured the ape-man. The bludgeon ceased to fall upon the wall, the heels no longer smote the earth. The assemblage was interested in the new suggestion. They eyed Tarzan hungrily. The mother who should have brought them food, the first woman, was dead. They did not know this. All they knew was that they were hungry, and that the first woman had brought them no food since the day before. They were not cannibals. Only in the last stages of hunger would they have devoured one another, even as shipwrecked sailors of civilized races have been known to do. But they did not look upon the stranger as one of their own kind. He was as unlike them as some of the other creatures that the first woman had brought them to feed upon. It was no more wrong to devour him than it would have been to devour an antelope. The thought, however, would not have occurred to most of them. The older girl it was who had suggested it to them. Nor would it have occurred to her had there been other food, for she knew that he had not been brought here for that purpose. He had been brought as the mate of the first woman, who, in common with the other women of this primitive race, hunted a new mate each season among the forests and jungles where the timid males lived their solitary lives, except for the brief weeks that they were held captive in the stone corrals of the dominant sex, and where they were treated with great brutality and contempt even by the children of their temporary spouses. Sometimes they managed to escape, though rarely, but eventually they were turned loose, since it was easier to hunt a new one the following season than to feed one in captivity for a whole year. There was nothing approximating love in the family relations of these savage half-brutes. The young, conceived without love, knowing not their own fathers, possessed not even an elemental affection for one another, nor for any other living thing. A certain tie bound them to their savage mothers, at whose breasts they suckled for a few short months, and to whom they looked for food until they were sufficiently developed to go forth into the forests and make their own kills, or secure whatever other food bountiful nature provided for them. Somewhere between the ages of 15 and 17, the young males were liberated and chased into the forest, after which their mothers knew them not from any other male, and at a similar age the females were taken to the maternal cave, where they lived, accompanying their mothers on the daily hunt, until they had succeeded in capturing a first mate. After that, they took up their abodes in separate caves, and the tie between parent and child was cut as cleanly as though it had never existed, and they might, the following season, even become rivals for the same man, or at any time quarrel to the death over the spoils of the chase. The building of the stone shelters and corrals in which the children and the males were kept was the only community activity in which the women engaged, and this work they were compelled to do alone, since the men would have escaped into the forest at the first opportunity, had they been released from the corrals to take part in the work of construction, while the children, as soon as they had become strong enough to be of any assistance, would doubtless have done likewise, but the great shes were able to accomplish their titanic labors alone. Equipped by nature with mighty frames and thews of steel, they quarried the great slabs from a side hill overlooking the amphitheater, slid them to the floor of the little valley, and pulled and pushed them into position by main strength and awkwardness, as the homely saying of our forefathers has it. Fortunately for them, it was seldom necessary to add to the shelters and corrals already built, since the high rate of mortality among the females ordinarily left plenty of vacant enclosures for maturing girls. Jealousy, greed, the hazards of the hunt, the contingencies of intertribal wars all took heavy toll among the adult shes. Even the despised male, fighting for his freedom, sometimes slew his captor. The hideous life of the Alalus was the natural result of the unnatural reversal of sex dominance. It is the province of the male to initiate love, and by his masterfulness to inspire first respect, then admiration in the breast of the female he seeks to attract. Love itself developed after these other emotions. The gradually increasing ascendancy of the female Alalus over the male eventually prevented the emotions of respect and admiration for the male from being aroused, with the result that love never followed. Having no love for her mate, and having become a more powerful brute, the savage Alalus woman soon came to treat the members of the opposite sex with contempt and brutality, with the result that the power, or at least the desire, to initiate love ceased to exist in the heart of the male. He could not love a creature he feared and hated. He could not respect or admire the unsexed creatures that the Alali women had become, and so he fled into the forests and the jungles, and there the dominant females hunted him, lest their race perish from the earth. It was the offspring of such savage and perverted creatures that Tarzan faced, fully aware of their cannibalistic intentions. The males did not attack him at once, but busily engaged themselves in fetching dry grass and small pieces of wood from one of the covered chambers, and while the three girls, one of them scarce 7 years of age, approached the ape-man warily with ready bludgeons, they prepared a fire over which they expected soon to be broiling juicy cuts from the strange creature that their hairy dam had brought them. One of the males, a lad of 16, held back, making excited signs with hands, head, and body. He appeared to be trying to dissuade or prevent the girls from the carrying out of their plan. He even appealed to the other boys for backing, but they merely glanced at the girls and continued their culinary preparations. At last, however, as the girls were deliberately approaching the ape-man, he placed himself directly in their path and attempted to stop them. Instantly the three little demons swung their bludgeons and sprang forward to destroy him. The boy dodged, plucking several of the feathered stones from his girdle, and flung them at his assailants. So swift and so accurate did the missiles speed that 2 girls dropped, howling, to the ground. The third missed, striking one of the other boys on the temple, killing him instantly. He was the youth who had stolen Tarzan's locket, which, being like all his fellow males a timid creature, he had kept continually covered by a palm, since the ape-man's return to consciousness had brought him out into the courtyard among them. The older girl, nothing daunted, leaped forward, her face hideous in a snarl of rage. The boy cast another stone at her, and then turned and ran toward the ape-man. What reception he expected, he himself probably did not know. Perhaps it was the recrudescence of a long-dead emotion of fellowship that prompted him to place himself at Tarzan's side. Possibly Tarzan himself, in whom loyalty to kind was strong, had inspired this reawakening of an atrophied soul sense. However that may be, the fact remains that the boy came and stood at Tarzan's side, while the girl, evidently sensing danger to herself in this strange new temerity of her brother, advanced more cautiously. In signs, she seemed to be telling him what she would do to him if he did not cease to interpose his weak will between her and her gastronomic desires. But he signed back at her defiantly and stood his ground. Tarzan reached over and patted him on the back, smiling. The boy bared his teeth horribly, but it seemed evident that he was trying to return the ape-man's smile. and now the girl was almost upon them. Tarzan was quite at a loss as to how to proceed against her. His natural chivalry restrained him from attacking her, and made it seem most repellent to injure her even in self-preservation. But he knew that before he was done with her he might even possibly have to kill her, and so, while looking for an alternative, he steeled himself for the deed he loathed. But yet he hoped to escape without that. The third woman, conducting her new mate from the cave to the corral where she would keep him imprisoned for a week or two, had heard the cadence beating of naked heels and heavy bludgeons arising from the corral of the first woman, and immediately guessed their import. The welfare of the offspring of the first woman concerned her not as an individual. Community instinct, however, prompted her to release them that they might search for food, and their services not be lost to the tribe through starvation. She would not feed them, of course, as they did not belong to her, but she would open their prison gate and turn them loose to fend for themselves, to find food or not to find it, to survive or to perish according to the inexorable law of the survival of the fittest. But the third woman took her time. Her powerful fingers entangled in the hair of her snarling spouse, she dragged the protesting creature to her corral, removed the great slab from before the entrance, pushing the man roughly within, accelerating his speed with a final kick, replaced the slab, and turned leisurely toward the nearby corral of the first woman. Removing the stone door, she passed through the two chambers and entered the corral at the moment that the oldest girl was advancing upon Tarzan. Pausing by the entranceway, she struck her bludgeon against the stone wall of the shelter, evidently to attract the attention of those within the corral. Instantly, all looked in her direction. She was the first adult female other than their own dam that the children of the first woman had seen. They shrunk from her in evident terror. The youth at Tarzan's side slunk behind the ape-man, nor did Tarzan wonder at their fear. The third woman was the first adult Alalis he had seen, since all of the time that he had been in the hands of the first woman he had been unconscious. The girl who had been threatening him with her great club seemed now to have forgotten him, and instead stood with snarling face and narrowed eyes confronting the newcomer. Of all the children, she seemed the least terrified. The ape-man scrutinized the huge brutish female standing at the far end of the corral with her savage eyes upon him. She had not seen him before, as she had been in the forest hunting at the time that the first woman had brought her prize back to the amphitheater. She had not known that the first woman had any male in her corral other than her own spawn. Here, indeed, was a prize. She would remove him to her own corral. With this idea in mind, and knowing that, unless he succeeded in dodging past her and reaching the entranceway ahead of her, he could not escape her, she moved very slowly toward him, ignoring now the other occupants of the corral. Tarzan, not guessing her real purpose, thought that she was about to attack him as a dangerous alien in the sacred precincts of her home. He viewed her great bulk, her enormous muscular development, and the huge bludgeon swinging in her ham-like hand, and compared them with his own defenseless nakedness. To the jungle-born, flight from useless and uneven combat carries with it no stigma of cowardice, and not only was Tarzan of the Apes jungle-born and jungle-raised, but the stripping of his clothes from him had now, as always before, stripped also away the thin and unnatural veneer of his civilization. It was, then, a savage beast that faced the oncoming Alalis woman, a cunning beast as well as a powerful one, a beast that knew when to fight and when to flee. Tarzan cast a quick glance behind him. There crouched the Alalis lad, trembling in fear. Beyond was the rear wall of the corral, one of the great stone slabs of which tilted slightly outward. Slow is the mind of man, slower his eye, by comparison, with the eye and the mind of the trapped beast seeking escape. So quick was the ape-man that he was gone before the third woman had guessed that he was contemplating flight, and with him had gone the eldest Alalis boy. Wheeling, all in a single motion, Tarzan had swung the young male to his shoulder, leaped swiftly the few paces that had separated him from the rear wall of the corral, and, cat-like, run up the smooth surface of the slightly tilted slab until his fingers closed upon the top, drawn himself over without a single backward glance, dropped the youth to the ground upon the opposite side, following him so quickly that they alighted almost together. Then he glanced about. For the first time he saw the natural amphitheater and the caves before several of which women still squatted. It would soon be dark. The sun was dropping behind the crest of the western hills. Tarzan saw but a single avenue of escape, the opening at the lower end of the amphitheater, through which the trail led down into the valley and the forest below. Toward this he ran, followed by the youth. Presently, a woman, sitting before the entrance to her cave, saw him. Seizing her cudgel, she leaped to her feet and gave immediate chase. Attracted by her, another and another took up the pursuit, until 5 or 6 of them thundered along the trail. The youth, pointing the way, raced swiftly ahead of the ape-man, but, swift as he was, he could not outdistance the lithe muscles that had so often in the past carried their master safely from the swift rush of a maddened Numa, or won him a meal against the fleetness of Bara the deer. The heavy, lumbering women behind them had no chance of overhauling this swift pair if they were to depend entirely upon speed, but that they had no intention of doing. They had their stone missiles, with which, almost from birth, they had practiced until approximate perfection was attained by each in casting them at either stationary or moving targets. But it was growing dark, the trail twisted and turned, and the speed of the quarry made them elusive marks at which to cast an accurate missile that would be so timed as to stun rather than to kill. Of course, more often than not, a missile intended to stun did actually kill, but the quarry must take that chance. Instinct warned the women against killing the males, though it did not warn them against treating them with the utmost brutality. Had Tarzan realized why the women were pursuing him, he would have run even faster than he did, and when the missiles began to fly past his head, perhaps he did accelerate his speed a trifle. Soon the ape-man reached the forest, and as though he had dissolved into thin air, disappeared from the astonished view of his pursuers, for now, indeed, he was in his own element. While they looked for him upon the ground, he swung swiftly through the lower terraces, keeping in view the Alalis boy racing along the trail beneath him. But with the man escaped, the women stopped and turned back toward their caves. The youth they did not want. For 2 or 3 years he would roam the forests unmolested by his own kind, and if he escaped the savage beasts and the spears and arrows of the ant people, he would come to man's estate and be fair prey for any of the great shes during the mating season. For the time being, at least, he would lead a comparatively safe and happy existence. His chances of survival had been materially lessened by his early escape into the forest. Had the first woman lived, she would have kept him safely within the walls of her corral for another year at least, when he would have been better fitted to cope with the dangers and emergencies of the savage life of the forest and the jungle. The boy, his keen ears telling him that the women had given up the pursuit, halted and looked back for the strange creature that had freed him from the hated corral, but he could see only a short distance through the darkness of the growing forest night. The stranger was not in sight. The youth pricked up his great ears and listened intently. There was no sound of human footsteps other than the rapidly diminishing ones of the retreating women. There were other sounds, however, unfamiliar forest sounds that filled his muddy brain with vague terrors. Sounds that came from the surrounding underbrush, sounds that came from the branches above his head, and, too, there were terrifying odors. Darkness, complete and impenetrable, had closed in upon him with a suddenness that left him trembling. He could almost feel it weighing down upon him, crushing him, and at the same time leaving him exposed to nameless terrors. He looked about him and could see naught, so that it seemed to him that he was without eyes, and being without a voice, he could not call out, either to frighten his enemies or to attract the attention of the strange creature that had befriended him, and whose presence had so strangely aroused in his own breast an inexplicable emotion, a pleasurable emotion. He could not explain it, he had no word for it, who had no word for anything, but he felt it, and it still warmed his bosom, and he wished in his muddy way that he could make a noise that would attract that strange creature to him again. He was lonely and much afraid. A crackling of the bushes nearby aroused him to new and more intimate terror. Something large was approaching through the black night. The youth stood with his back against a great tree. He dared not move. He sniffed, but what movement of the air there was took course from him in the direction of the thing that was creeping upon him out of the terrible forest, and so he could not identify it, but his instinct told him that the creature had identified him and was doubtless creeping closer to leap upon him and devour him. He knew naught of lions, unless instinct carries with it a picture of the various creatures of which the denizens of the wild are instinctively afraid. In all his life he had never been outside the corral of the first woman, and as his people are without speech, his dam could have told him nothing about the outside world. Yet when the lion roared, he knew that it was a lion. End of chapter 3. Recording by Matthew Reese, Cordova, Illinois.